Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Globespan 24/7, owned and produced and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh of Globespan. With us tonight is our technical assistant supervisor, Mr. Devin Bassoon. We have two very distinguished guests tonight, very distinguished personalities. Mr. Vincent Alexander, who is former registrar of the University of Guyana, and currently he's a commissioner on GECOM, the Guyana Elections Commission. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think he's the most senior person at GECOM at the moment. Mr. Ralph Ramkaran is also joining us. There seem to be some technical problems connecting with him, so we will start the program without Mr. Ramkaran, and he will join us later. For now, Mr. Vincent Alexander will, I suppose, carry the burden. For now, our topic tonight is independence, an evaluation of where we are today and our future, what is in store for us in the future. We celebrated Independence May 26th, just under 2 weeks ago. A week, in fact, sorry, just a week ago. And so I'll begin with Mr. Alexander. For you, sir, what's the state of affairs of our independence 55 years later?
Their independence represents a fundamental difference to being a colony insofar as the people and their representatives are given the mantle decisions for the country. And I think one ought to recognize that that's a fundamental difference. In the case of Guyana, we have moved on from merely being independent to being a republic because it is with republicanism that the idea of sovereignty being vested in the people resides. An independent nation may still fall within the old system in some regards, with the Queen being the head of state, with the Governor General. And though people say it's titular and formal, I think the experience of Grenada tells us that one really has to move on from merely being independent to republican status if one wants to ensure that, in fact, one has been able to wrestle sovereignty, because Grenada showed us that they were independent. They had a Governor General, and when they had internal problems, it was that Governor General who boldly said that he had responsibilities and he exercised them by inviting a foreign power to intervene. So we saw the implications of that level of so-called independence. So we've gone beyond that. We're a republic, and therefore we have ultimate responsibility for what takes place in Guyana. I think one has to recognize that. And having gotten ultimate responsibility, then really there's no one for us to blame about the state of things in Guyana. We are ourselves responsible. There are those who often say that we'd be better off if we were not independent. Whose guess? I don't know that we'd necessarily be better off. But I would go further to say that the British didn't merely give us independence because we asked for it. I think that at the conclusion of the Second World War, there was more or less universal acceptance that countries should be granted independence. And that universal acceptance had also to do with, I think, the colonizers themselves, recognizing that where we were, it was burdensome for them to continue to be directly responsible states. And so they prefer to adopt what may be called the neo-colonial relationship, which in them to continue to make wealth, but not be responsible for administrative affairs. So it was a less costly relationship. So the challenge of independence was how do we in fact go beyond the flag independence into a situation where indeed we become masters of our own destiny, where we're able to overcome the economic system which places us in the periphery of the former colonizers and allow us to make as much use as possible of the resources at our disposal for our benefit. In that regard, I would argue that the foreigners, as I said early on, really had an interest in the neo-colonial state rather than the colonial state, and therefore to use market relations on one hand, the peripheral state of our economies on the other hand, and international organizations such as the IMF and the World Bank to sustain the neo-colonial state, and therefore, in fact, to deprive us of the independence that we were really seeking to have. Independence meaning having control over one's resources, being able to make decisions about one's resources, and being able to exploit those resources for the benefit of the local people. And I would argue that in many regards, even though we acquired Republican status, that both independence and Republican status represents political achievements, but they don't in themselves represent the totality of independence, because the totality has to do with control over your economy. It allows you really to determine what you do and what would not be done to you. And I would argue that we still have not necessarily acquired that full control over economy, because we are still primary producers in a world where primary products, the prices fluctuate, while the secondary goods, the prices seem not to fluctuate. So there's greater stability with those who produce secondary goods. We can argue the case that we attempted to wrestle our economy in our attempts at nationalization, but that given we were nationalizing again primary goods, I think they were able to squeeze us, and to the extent that we came out of nationalization, arrangement and a free market arrangement where we have not quite achieved the situation where the state is a facilitator of development. We seem to be clutching to the view that the private sector is the engine of growth, and I'm not questioning the role of the private sector, but I think it has to be a complementary situation where on one hand the private sector is the engine of growth, on the other hand the state is a facilitator of development. I think we're still grappling with making the state a facilitator of development in such a way that we do two things: that would see our economy move beyond being primary producers into a more self-reliant economy on the one hand, and would see the state so regulating the wealth creation and distribution that the people at large would be beneficiaries of that process.
So,
I think that's where we're at.
So you're saying that, in essence, if I may just interpret what you just said, that we're really not independent. We are still under quote unquote neo-colonial control by the industrialized powers,
In the main,
the
yes,
Western
I
powers.
agree. Yes.
And in retrospect, would have been better off just remaining under the colonial system, or at the minimum have the Queen as the head of state through a Governor General, which we had for 4 years, on the system under which, quote unquote, we have a neutral observer in order to manage whatever conflict we have at home. As you said, that whenever we had issues, the Governor General called in the political leaders and try to find a resolution to the issue?
Well, as I said at the very inception, the question of independence in some regards was not necessarily totally a question of choice, because the colonizers themselves, I think, were engineering this independence. So we may say, look, we might be better off if we still a colony, but I don't think the colonizers wanted to continue to have a colony. So it wasn't really much of an option. And when one takes the fact that the view was that we need to be in charge of our own destiny, then certainly we were facilitators and collaborators in the enterprise of the colonizers, probably unwittingly, in moving in the direction of independence. Now, having said that, being merely material being, human being is a psychological and spiritual being as well. And notwithstanding my earlier contention about independence, I think one has to also accept that independence from the perspective of the psychological person, that we cannot consider ourselves to be in a disadvantageous position. We can't consider ourselves to be in a worse position. We are in a position where we are challenged to achieve what we want to achieve, but we have the facility to seek to work to achieve it. If we weren't independent, we would not have had that facility. We would have been dictated to more or less. So that from a psychological perspective, say that we are in a better state, and that better state allows us to still aspire and to still seek to find ways and means to achieve the ultimate independence that we wish to achieve.
Okay, we are being joined now by Mr. Ramkar. Mr. Ramkar, are you hearing me?
Yeah, I'm hearing you. I'm sorry.
All right, so let me just give a brief introduction, Mr. Ramkar, Senior Counsel, former Speaker of the House, I guess one of the longest serving speakers of the House, Member of Parliament for a very long time. I don't know the exact numbers, maybe a number of years. He may want to tell us. And our discussion tonight is on independence and evaluation. And where do we go from here with independence? Mr. Vincent Alexander was discussing and talking about the state of our independence. You have anything to contribute to that before we move forward? What is independence? What does it mean for Guyana?
Well, it means that we can make our own decisions, which we have been doing since the time we gained independence, making our own decisions in inverted commas, but also being independent in a world in which we are a very small country, and the very small and poor country, large in size, but very small in population. But that for a large part of that period of independence, we had to contend with the Cold War. Now that the Cold War is over, it seems to be different areas of it's no longer a unit. The Cold War was over. It was a unipolar world with the United States being dominant. But as we see that China is growing from strength to strength, Russia still has a large amount of nuclear weapons and is modernizing those weapons. So we live in a really multipolar world, and we have to walk between the raindrops. Fortunately, we have discovered oil, and that will help us a little bit along the way, unless the courts and the people who are behind the climate change environmental things shut down the oil industry, which is a possibility, having regard to what happened in Holland, in the Netherlands, and what has been happening with ExxonMobil, who is the biggest partner Guyana has. So we just have to be very careful. We've had a long history of struggle, one for the independence, secondly for free and fair elections, for democracy. That struggle continues and will continue. But now that we are having some more resources, I hope that it will help us to strengthen our independence further.
I was just being a devil's advocate with Mr. Vincent Alexander earlier. In light of what issues and problems we have faced from independence till now, 55 years, are we better off with independence?
I think we're definitely better off, because I remember in the early days after independence, up to the 70s and even 80s, people were saying we were better under the British. We were never better under the British. I mean, making our own decisions and fighting our own battles here internally is very beneficial for Guyana. Our independence is, the feel of the feeling that we make our own decisions or have our own struggles, set our own pace, is enormously beneficial to us as a nation. If we were a colony, I mean, under the thumb of the British.
You mentioned one problem that we have, which is economy, and in terms of oil. And so before I touch that, any other problems? First, Mr. Ramcharan, that we face.
We have a big ethnic problem. We have a big ethnic problem, which the ethnic problem can be solved, but easily, because ethnic problems are enormously intractable. They're all over the world. Where they are, you see them, but they can be resolved or they can be mitigated politically, as in Northern Ireland, for example. But the question is, Guyana has not taken the plunge to mitigate those problems politically. We all know how that can be done. We have gone over that a million times, but it hasn't been done. So
let's hit the nail on the head. By ethnic problem, you mean a political problem? You mean question of power?
The ethnic problem translates into a political dispute, because our two big ethnic groups and their allies have support two different political parties. So because of that, the ethnic problem has transformed itself into a political problem, and the political problem has to be resolved at some point in time before the ethnic problem can subside. Not likely to disappear, but it can subside.
Before I query you on a proposed solution, let me hear from Mr. Alexander whether he agrees.
Well, I don't have a problem with what Ralph has said. My understanding of what he said. We are a plural society, not of our own making. It's historical. That in itself lends to differences which could be latent or could be active. And unfortunately, in the case of Guyana, those differences have been active and have been a part of what has led. Well, the political system has exploited, in a sense, those differences, and so in fact they have helped to maintain an antagonistic relationship, because there could be differences, but there could be a non-antagonistic relationship. But I think that the political system before independence, the very evolution of Guyana, the political system has fostered antagonism across the ethnic groups. It has been latent sometimes, been more active at other times. And so I do agree that what is required is for, at the political level, for us to clear, one, we recognize, formally recognize the problem, accept that there's a problem, and commit to a solution of the problem. And I think that alone will take us halfway down the road in terms of that problem.
And when you say we recognize the problem, you specifically mean the two political parties, because they're the ones representing the two main ethnic
Well,
groups.
I would say the people, and more particularly the parties that they support. I think that if the parties, as the leading and guiding lights, were to articulately accept that there is this problem that requires a solution, then indeed we'll be halfway down the road to solving the problem.
And what's preventing them from acknowledging, accepting the problem?
Well, I think, I think that in each of the ethnic groups, those groups are not themselves monolithic. Those groups have classes and class interests. And to a large extent, what I think happens is that a particular class within the group co-opts the group at large to occupy economic space for the benefit of the class, with the psychological moment for the group that we're in charge, we're in power. But the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, it is really class domination that occurs, whichever group may be in power. It's really class domination that occurs. And that class domination even facilitates an insipid relationship between the ruling class, so to speak, that facilitates the continuation of the problem in the interests of the class.
Ralph, does the ruling class exploit the ethnic conflict?
Well, I don't know. It's very difficult. That's a very difficult issue to respond to, and it's very complicated as well. There's no doubt that in each group there's a ruling class. The people who don't fight at all is the ruling class. The ruling class don't fight with each other. They get us, the ordinary people, to fight their battles for them. The fact is that the power of ethnicity has overwhelmed, I believe. The power of ethnicity has overwhelmed the politics in Guyana. Take, for example, the APNU AFC in 2015, which had very prominently as part of its manifesto a power sharing mechanism, but they didn't proceed with it. It didn't happen. Forget the excuses. They didn't proceed with it. They made a decision not to proceed with it. Now, in whose interest? I don't know whose benefit that was. I analyzed it to mean, my understanding of it was APNU AFC, whether it's senior leadership, that is to say its ruling class, or the influence of its membership, whoever it was, I think they decided that there is a great danger that if they implement such a system, they might at some point in time in the future come in second, as they have always done. They had an alliance with the AFC, which allowed them to win the elections in 2015. But they won the elections by 5,000 votes. and they must have seen that the AFC was losing traction. So there was a danger. Well, that is why the results itself showed that the AFC was losing traction because they got far more votes in two previous elections. So I don't know which class was responsible for that, but I think that they did not proceed with that because of they felt that they would come in second. Now, the PVP has the same issue. The PVP feels that it's on top. Why should it share power? But I don't know. I can't speak for the PVP. I don't know if the PVP leadership is not realizing that they won the election by one seat. So they face the same, they're going to face the same problem. What the calculations are, I don't know. It could well be that the improvement of the economy will give them a lift. I don't know. But the problem of power, and whether it's the problem of power for the ruling class or for everybody else in the ethnic group, I am not too sure.
I, I think you're alluding to some kind of power sharing when you were saying they didn't want to engage or change the constitution.
Well, the APNO FC had a specific program, and that's what I'm talking about.
And that
It was a
program was,
power sharing program
well, that is what they had promised. Plus, they had
of
promised
constitutional
constitutional
reform.
reform, electoral reform, and in the end, they did none of it. I think that
Yeah.
disappointed most of the country. That in the end decided to, I guess, vote against them in 2020. Mr. Alexander?
Well, I share the view that, and we seem to be merging now into what's the solution. I share the view that there is a need for shared governance, um, shared governance which is both horizontal and vertical. To a large extent, Guyana is still uh, has enclaves, ethnic enclaves, that contours of which correspond with our administrative systems. And if we were to have a system that allowed for greater autonomy in those enclaves where people cannot point fingers to others about decision making and the state of affairs, that one way to help with the ethnic problem.
Are you suggesting like a federalist decentralized system where each region, each community
No,
runs its own affairs?
no, I'm not suggesting a federalist decentralized system. I'm suggesting a local government system that gives much more authority and resources to the local people, not a federal system. I have my issues with the federal system.
But a
At the same time,
decentralized system with local power.
yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
And at the same time, at the national level, for shared governance as well, that is facilitative of that decentralization which I referred to, and that allows decision making in such a manner that no group feels excluded and left out. So I think that both the vertical, the decentralization, and the lateral, the sharing, is critical to the way forward. This system doesn't have the lateral, doesn't have to be something that is infinite, because once we get to the point where people are comfortable with the vertical arrangement, and once the lateral system itself culturally adjusts to one of equality and equity and proper human rights and things like that, then the culture would be what takes us forward rather than the structure.
During the 5-year tenure of the coalition, it wasn't done. I mean, they had an opportunity to do it. Mr. Ramkern attempted to explain why. You have your views on that? Why wasn't it done?
Well, it certainly wasn't done. Excuse me. Doing that has to do with commitment. I'm not quite sure that the people who were in charge were sufficiently committed.
I take it you didn't have much influence on them.
I'm a citizen. I'm a citizen. I'm not a part of the regime. I wasn't a part of the regime. That's lots of people feel otherwise. I am a citizen. I wasn't on a slate. I'm not a member of the party. I don't walk in the party's corridors of power. If you go back to my own disposition, you will see that during the period of the constitutional reform, that the younger members, of which I would have been a part at that time, did come forward and make the proposition for shared governance. So, as I'm saying, I don't think that there was necessarily the level of commitment. I think a part of the problem also has to do with the trust between the forces. If, for example, when Granger suggested that he was willing to have conversation and had proposed Nagamootoo as the person to have that conversation, then they would have been further tested on the sincerity or absence of on the question. But the rejection by the PPP to have the conversation demonstrated that they too did not have a commitment and therefore did not hold the feet of the APNU to the fire in that regard.
I believe the PPP statement at the time was that Moses Nagamootoo didn't have any power and they didn't want any conversation with him. They wanted, I presume they would have preferred someone higher up.
I think that was a couple. I don't think I think that was a couple. Prove that to be. Don't claim it to be, prove it to be. They claimed it to be and copped out.
I think, Ralph, you wanted to say something on that?
Well, you ask a prime minister whose sole responsibility is the press, and don't expect people to say that he doesn't have anything. But putting Moses Nagamootoo forward is like to the PPP. It's like flying a red flag to a bull. I mean, and UPNO AFC knew that. Why do you think this is not a question of them deciding to have talks and seriously believe that putting Moses forward is a great step? This is because they knew what the PPP would say. We're not talking to Moses. Moses just left the PPP. Moses was senior member of the executive of the PPP. Just left the PPP. Given the portfolio of the press. I mean, be serious, Vincent. I mean, I'm not saying that the PPP was otherwise interested. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that to carry the argument that they were not interested, you have to go a little bit more than using Moses Nagamootoo.
Let me introduce some controversy here. The PPP claims that it is involved in shared governance. Almost half of its, or more than half of its members of the cabinet are quote unquote non-Indians. The ethnic groups are well represented in the government, in state corporations and state agencies and so on and so forth. There is equitable distribution of positions among all the ethnic groups. It's not a fair argument.
It's not a fair argument because it has to do with what Henry Jeffrey has called the issue of legitimacy. No matter how many non-ethnic Indians you have in the PVP government or its arrangement, even if you argue it does not discriminate this, that, and the other. When either political party is in power, the other side does not feel that they legitimately represent my interest. And that's the problem. Shared governance doesn't mean that. It means that our major ethnic groups and their allies must have a space at the table and share in the meals that are going around. That is what it means. You know, both parties are now talking, well, we're stuck on that. I mean, that's not going to go anywhere, no matter how much we talk about it, because both parties are now talking about inclusive governance. And when we were in the Constitutional Reform Commission, Vincent will remember that we set up this structure for inclusive governance. It's all there, but it's not operative. We set up some parliamentary commissions. They have been amended by the standing orders, have amended them. There are 4 of them. Um, Sectoral commissions. We set up some constitutional commissions, about half a dozen or so, and some other things. But those things are not working. If they were working, we set up Article 13 of the Constitution that says that that there must be consultation. Those things are not in effect. They're not working. So there is the structure for inclusive governance exists, but they don't work. And I think if shared governance is not on the table, if it has been taken off the table by the 2 main parties, though we must continue to struggle for it, we must insist that they utilize what is already available. Take, for example, the Human Rights Commission. Now, they argue that what was created, the way in which the Human Rights Commission was structured, makes it difficult to comprise it. There are too many people to consult, or the people to consult are not available, or some such issue. But why hasn't the PPP in all these years that since constitutional reform come to the parliament and say, or talk to the opposition and say that, look, we can't get this Human Rights Commission going because of A, B, C, and D. And this thing is important for Guyana. Why don't we amend the Constitution by the following means in order to get this commission going? Because it's very important. Nothing of that has happened. They just abandoned it. It just abandoned. It has never been implemented.
But the other side also abandoned it. The coalition
Well,
also.
they haven't pressed it. They abandoned it during their term of office. But that was not on the horizon for anybody. I'm saying that we have in place the systems for inclusive governance, and that includes inclusive governance. I have long propounded a theory, but nobody's going to be interested in it now, about about shared governance at the local government level, at the RDC level. But I might even write about it this weekend. But nobody's going to be interested in these things. But I mean, the issue of decentralization is vital to the issue of inclusive governance. The central government should not do anything that the local government can do. Central government should not be involved in anything that the regional democratic councils and the NDCs can do. That will take a very big overhaul. But the biggest overhaul will be a change in attitudes, because our attitude is everything must be done at the top, because the top are the people who know everything. So, I mean, it's going to take a very big leap to decentralized, but decentralization is also vital for inclusive governance.
Well, Vincent did say that. He said both at the central as well as the local level.
Yeah.
And
But we're talking things that should have been done 20 years ago, you know. We're still fighting battles that are 2 decades old.
If I'm not mistaken, and I think Ralph, you may also know about this. Didn't the UN provide some funding for some constitutional reform over the last 10 years?
I don't think there haven't been any recent funding for constitutional reform. They were interested in the constitutional reform now. They were interested in funding over the past few years. But the process is not going anywhere. I mean, they will fund, I'm sure there's funding available if they see something happening, but nothing is happening.
Now, this, I think the president and the vice president, as well as the attorney general, said last week, I believe, that that there will be some kind of commission established very soon for constitutional reform, and that he promised, the vice president has promised by the end of this month that there will be a bill for some kind of electoral reform. And I think people, well, electoral reform will be tied in with constitutional reform. You can't have one without the other. Mr. Alexander?
When you were saying we can't have one without the other, but all indications are that we're talking about one without the other, as I have seen it. I have not, I've seen, I could discern an agenda for electoral reform. I can't discern an agenda for constitutional reform. So that it appears as if that the movement is towards one rather than the other. Now, the question here has to do with the question of inclusion. With inclusion, I think that today in Guyana, notwithstanding what you attempted to say, we have the most exclusionary position than we've ever had. The most exclusionary. You can't argue that, well, you know, you have African Guyanese in government and all of that, when in fact, the body that mustered some 40-something% of the votes, of which number most would be of African descent, is excluded. You can't talk inclusion in that situation. And then when you look to see who are the people who are purportedly representing this other ethnic group, so to speak, what do you see? You have a situation, for example, where one person, because of his allegiance to the PPP, heads more than one body in the state, as if we have a shortage of manpower. But it shows clearly that you can only be there if you are clearly representing a particular interest. And if you are clearly representing that interest in the context of our electoral system and the results, then you don't represent ethnic interests. So we have a big problem of commitment, and the term I used earlier is the political culture. I think, in other words, Ralph referred to that. But there has to be a paradigm shift in our political culture that will facilitate a resolution of our problem. There seems to be no such paradigm shift. We seem to be hardening our positions that it's me or you, and that's not helpful.
I mentioned electoral reform, and you also mentioned it and seemed quite excited about it as well. Why do we need electoral reform? What's wrong with the electoral system?
Well, let's start off from the constitutional reform process. We have never completed what we agreed to do in terms of our electoral system, never completed it. In that electoral system in 2003, and Ralph could bail me out on this, we agreed that we would establish 10 constituencies that coincide with the regions because we didn't have the time, given the court ruled that we should have elections in 2003. We didn't have the time to do the detailed work to create real constituencies. The Constitution provides for a larger number of parliamentarians derived from constituencies that we
You mean
presently have.
geographic?
Okay. Yes.
We
refuse to do that. So the very simple, the very things we committed to, purportedly committed to, that are in our laws, in our constitution, we are not in practice following. And that's a big part of the problem. So the process, in some regards, turned out to be a sham. It was a process probably because of the political climate, because of the national environment, but seemed not to have been a process to which the political directorate was really committed. And so even the things we agreed to, none of the issues that required a referendum have ever been raised and discussed with the view of holding a referendum after the elections of 2003. None of them. But if you go to the report, to the select committee report to the parliament, you'll see a commitment, recommendations of specific things that were unanimously agreed to in the parliament. And no one has taken any effort to realize those things. So we have a serious problem of commitment.
But aside from the geographic system or the constituency system, are issues, for example, when enforcing the current laws, for example, the attempt to rig the election last year, isn't that a serious concern?
I think that the reason why the issue is being pressed by the government, I think, I don't have any information. Like Vincent, I don't walk the corridors of power. My party got only 2,000 votes. I think the reason that the issue is being pressed now, and I think that it's unfortunate. The reason the thing is being pressed now is because of the experiences during last year, when
You mean electoral reforms?
Electoral reforms. I think the government is anxious to get offenses created where there are violations of the rules, of the electoral rules, and penalties created for those violations. That's all well and good. But that is not election reform. That's not electoral reform. Electoral reform goes far beyond that. And I don't mind the method in which it started. I'm quite happy if it starts by a bill laid in the parliament, but a bill that enables civil society to consider it, to make representation, real representations, not writing letters to the press and all, real serious representations to the government. A bill can occasion that if the government is interested in doing that. So it doesn't matter how it started. But I don't believe that what is going to happen is going to be electoral reform. I don't believe, for example, that the government is going to create 33 constituencies, which the Constitution allows, and abolish these fake systems that they put up of 10 constituencies with 25 members. I don't believe they're going to create 33 constituencies and allow the 32 other seats to be the top-up seats. That is what we talk. That's what I mean when I talk about constitutional reform. That is serious business. The other stuff, I think that is what they're more interested in than anything else. But that's okay. But it doesn't help the process of constitutional reform, of serious constitutional reform, along.
The government commissioners moved yesterday to remove some individuals who were involved in an attempt to rig the election last year. The CEO, the deputy CEO, the chair for Region 10. Good move, bad move, necessary? Is it necessary to remove them in order to have free and fair elections?
Well, they should have resigned, but but they haven't.
Mr. Alexander?
I'll pick the specific case of Roxanne Myers. Specific case of Roxanne Myers. I have access to the motion. The motion has 15 reasons why Roxanne Myers should not be the DCU. Of the 15 reasons, 10 simply say that she aided and abetted Lowenfield. 10 say that she aided and abetted Lowenfield. 10 do not say anything specifically that she did. That's a violation.
And the other 5 says?
3, 2 of them, one says that she facilitated a meeting of a minister of government at Ashman's building. The other one said that she instructed the police to have people removed from some part of GECOM, including a commissioner. The other, so that's 12. The other 3 are not causes. The other 3 are, like for example, the last one said, for the reasons above, she should not be. But where I sit, the moment Roxanne Myers was approved, there was objection to her being employed. And so for me, this is largely a follow-through of what occurred before elections. They have never been comfortable with Roxanne Myers, and they have juxtaposed Roxanne Myers to one Vishnu Prasad, who previously occupied the position. So that there's a lot that is happening for which, for me, the elections and what occurred in the elections is but the moment, but not the real reason. That is my disposition to some of those things.
But even if it's one reason, isn't it sufficient for a case against her?
If it's what?
Even if it's just one reason out of the 15, that's not sufficient reason. I mean, in a court of law, all you need is one reason.
One reason is sufficient reason, but not one contested reason. The reasons I mentioned will be subject to contestation. They will be subject to contestation. So I don't know that there is one acceptable and valid reason, even though I mentioned that 3 were reasons that pointed to her directly. But are there reasons for removal of somebody from the position of Deputy Chief Elections Officer? So I'm making the case that, what we are dealing with in Guyana, there's a claim of rigged elections, right? You're going to have a problem of all sorts once any set of people believe that the other set have done things to disadvantage them that are not legitimate. And if you go into an election with a bloated list and people are convinced that this bloated list is being used, we just don't have what it takes to go forward. We have to be able to go to ground zero, clean the system up, and then move forward in good faith. We are not operating in good faith. All we are doing is finding moments to point fingers and to vindicate others. And that's
Yeah,
a big part of our problem.
Yeah, I have 2 points to make. One, I noticed you didn't mention anything about Lowenfield and Mr. Mingo. Does that mean that there's a stronger case against them as opposed to Ms. Myers on the issue
I
of
mentioned the Myers case because that's the one I've been able to pay attention to so far.
Mhm.
The Lowenfield case, I have not yet done that, and I am prepared when I have done that and to deal with that. When you come to the Mingo situation, I have said publicly and probably on this program that the Mingo situation need not to have taken us to where it took us, and that it is partly contrived. And let me say why I say that. Be Mingo right or wrong, GCOM from 2011, I think it was, adopted a system that provided for the commissioners to be recipients of every single statement of poll. And on that basis, any result brought to the commission could be challenged based on those statements of poll that the commissioners have. Because what we do, we sit in 2020, we even placed a hidden identification on each statement of poll. And when they came to us to be signed, we had an ultraviolet light to check to make sure it was a valid statement of poll. Then we signed. So we were collecting those statements of polls. The PPP commissioners abandoned the process, and therefore they deprived themselves of the tool that the electoral system provided for them to authenticate and or challenge what was brought to the commission. So the system, in some regards, Mingo being right or wrong, was not allowed to work. If they had stayed the course with those statements of polls, they would have been able to do what I did in 2011. In 2011, results were brought before us. Calculation of seats were brought before us. That was not correct. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, it was an attempted fraud. But because of where we sat and because of the information which we had, we were able to reverse that. And we didn't have to wait all the months we're now complaining about. But people, in their excitement, in their enthusiasm, in their whatever it was, abandoned their roles, went to play other people's roles, and then could not fall back on a system that was in place to make sure Mingo, right or wrong, could not go the full distance.
But surely it's quite troubling for Mingo to just belt out numbers out of his head without having these statements of polls and to use a bed sheet instead of the spreadsheet. I mean, it became quite comical. People were laughing at us.
I am not commenting on that, but I'm saying that there was a system in place. Even if there was a flaw at one point, there were mechanisms for correction and rectification. And we failed ourselves by abandoning the responsibility to have those systems work.
Mr. Ramkran said in a normal situation, in a normal country, people would resign. But the three of them are just holding on. They have no plans.
We don't have a normal country. We don't have a normal country.
Mr. Ramkar, you want to comment on not whether we have a normal country?
I know, but all that stuff. I mean, look, these people try to rig the elections. I mean, you know, if I were not on TV, I would use some proper language to describe it. They try to rig the elections. It's in the DNA of the PNC. Their history is rigging elections. They come to power again. They once again try the same thing they've been trying all their life. And they should get out of the place. I mean, the people should resign. The man Bodu, he didn't resign, but he didn't last beyond his contract. Vincent voted to not to renew his contract.
Mm-hmm.
So these people, these three people have done far worse. I mean, three times Lowenfield put up different numbers. This Mingo. I mean, I don't know. My father and Mingo's older brother were very good friends. I mean, I'm sorry that the younger brother turned out like this, but Mingo used a spreadsheet which was wrong. Look at the events, get sick, come back, and then you're gonna put up a bedsheet that you can't read the figures. I mean, how can you remain in a system like that? How can anybody contemplate people like those who have committed those acts to remain in an electoral system? And for a party which has a history of doing this kind of thing, that is not rational.
So just talking about electoral reform and constitutional reform, it looks like it looks like it's going to be two different issues, and I had suggested that perhaps it should be merged into one. You being a senior counsel, Mr. Ramkaran.
I don't think it needs to be merged into one because the some people, and my party was campaigning in the elections that we don't need a top up of 40 or 32 people that the Constitution allows. We need a top up of 15 at most 20 people. And then you can have the 45. You can have 45 electoral districts or constituencies.
First past the post?
Huh?
First past the post.
First past the post. Well, you can see that in this current atmosphere, nothing is going to be agreed upon. But we already have a constitution which already allows 33 constituencies to be, they said half. Well, you know, we have this big problem with half. 33 is a little bit more than half, but I suppose everybody will agree for 32. 32 constituencies to be by force past the post. Now, Vincent Alexander is too young to remember, but he knows history good, so he might remember it from history. In 1961, the last elections of force past the post, we had 32 constituencies. The constituencies were somewhat lopsided because in Borpis, in the Jagan area, PVP area, you had one large area, was one constituency, and so on. But if you had 32 constituencies in 1961, it's not going to be a very big problem for the parties to now sit down and decide to have 32 constituencies again. That groundwork essentially is there already. So that can be done without constitutional reform. And I would live with that, despite the fact that we don't really need 32 or 33 top-up seats. But I will live with that, and it will give the people of Guyana the chance to get their problems solved at the local level. It helps decentralization. One of my staff had her electric meter not working. She lives right till over the west coast. She had to come to GPL. GPL abused her and said, "You're tampering with your meter, that's why it's not working." But we can't help you. Go to Vreeden Hoop. She go to Vreeden Hoop and had to spend a half day for them to get her meter, to electric meter, to be working. Your MP should be doing those things. People at the MP's office should be able to pick up the phone and get those things done. So it's really a serious problem. Everybody who got a little problem, if they're no politician, they end up at Congress Place or Freedom House. Things can't work like that. We far gone. Are we going to run an oil economy like that? I mean, good heavens.
the political parties have reached out to the smaller parties on this issue of electoral reform or even constitutional reform?
No, I don't think they think that we are of much importance.
But
No,
I'm sure
no.
they would, because I don't think you could have reform without unless you engage all the parties and the people. And the vice president also said that there'll be consultations with the public at large. I think the president also said the same, and the attorney general.
Well, I hope so. I hope there are consultations and they listen to people. I have something to say. What I just said. How are they going to continue with an electoral system that is not responsive to the needs of the Guyanese people? Remember, this electoral system has a long history, you know. We have come around, unlike the other Caribbean territories, we have come around because of the electoral system we have in our politics. We have come around to accepting the system of proportionality. To accepting proportionality, we all agree that the percentage of votes that a party gets, that is the percentage of seats it has to get in parliament. But there are two different routes to that. The current route, which is not responsive to our political system, and the route of first past the post for some seats, which is more responsive to our political system.
I believe you mentioned 61, but I believe in 64 and probably up until 2006, there was quote unquote, lack of a better term, a rank system where no, where
64
once
PR was in 64.
right. So once you're chosen by the party, you cannot be removed. The leader cannot remove you unless you resign.
Yes.
Am I right?
Yes. And the PNC for years, which had resisted a constitutional amendment to allow the parties to remove an MP, because they were the beneficiaries for decades of PVP members crossing the floor. When Corbyn got into story with McAllister and one or two other people, the PNC then agreed for the amendment, which the PVP had always been pressing, recall legislation. So they had the recall legislation. Of course, there's a lot of criticism. Up to now, there's criticism over it.
And is that part of something that you're also suggesting?
No, I'm suggesting that on the constituency system, there can be a different system of recall. The system of recall has to be from the local people.
Not from the leadership.
If you're in the Bel Air constituency where I live, you represent the Bel Air constituency. Well, the Bel Air, and I'm representing a political party. The representatives of the members of that political party in my constituency have the right of recall and no one else.
Mr. Alexander?
First of all, my views on the question of the electoral system do not differ in any significant way from what Ralph has said. In fact, in the constitutional reform process, we carefully included wording in that constitution which says that the elected should be accountable to the electorate. And what we really meant by that, as I understood at the time, was that we move closer and closer to a system where the people could determine their representative. So that there were two things involved there. One, more constituencies, and our system does not need just 10 constituencies. If you look at the historical results, we know that 5 to 10 seats could balance PR. 5 to 10 seats can balance PR. You have a consistency of a difference of 3 to 4 seats, 1 seat difference, so that we can get we can max out on constituencies. And secondly, when you max out on constituencies, it also allows for individuals, it can allow for individuals to contest without necessarily being in a party slate. So there's a new dynamic there, where in a constituency, somebody who really the people feel represents their interests, is honest, etc., can participate and contest. So it brings a new dynamics in the composition of the parliament. So I think this is an area in which there is scope for a change in our electoral politics, but it is being resisted, completely being resisted. I'd like to go back to a point though that Ralph made. You know, Ralph said that Reagan is in the DNA of the PNC. Now, I don't know how biological the PNC is, you know, or if this is social biology, because they also have social biology as a subject. But, you know, I think that the PPP has been far more successful in branding the PNC than the PNC has been successful in branding the PPP. But notwithstanding that absence of success, the PPP are not any paragons of virtue to be pointed the finger at the PNC and the PNC being rigorous. We must have a truth commission, and that is where we must deal with this question of how we've treated elections historically. Because I maintain that there would have been serious problems in our last elections based on the bloated list. I made my own observations where I saw that unprecedented numbers of people were voting without ID and being identified to vote. And incidentally, where this occurred is the same place where the 47 boxes didn't have documentation. So, I mean, Ralph has a right to his view, but his view is a bias. It's a bias that is brought forward. It may have origin, it is certainly a bias. So there is a predetermination in the matter. But I'm saying in Guyana, the same way we have a problem of plurality, that plurality has a plurality of views about how these parties deal with elections and the PPP. There are no paragons of virtues, and therefore I am not going to be party to finger in the PNC in a system where I think that all of us got to go to ground zero on these matters.
Just for station identification, you are watching GlobeSpan 24/7, owned, produced, and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh, with Mr. Devin Bissoon as our techie operator. Mr. Ramkaran, you want to any rebuttal?
Well, I don't know. You know,
I mean, plurality of views, Mr. Alexander is saying.
Trump says the opposition in America rigged the elections too.
Mm-hmm.
I'm getting through with it.
So where do we stand now? I mean, we discussed independence, where we are. You said we are somewhat better off today than we were under colonial rule. Where are we heading?
I would say that the question of independence, which I early on described as two levels, the economic level and the psychological and spiritual level. And from what Ralph said, I think that he corresponded with what I was saying. I think to a very large extent, the way in which we pursue economic development will determine our emergence into a more independent state. Because what is required is an economy that is robust, that has linkages between primary and secondary production, an economy that is not subject to expropriation of its wealth by foreigners and to the detriment of locals. And so basically the challenge of our independence on one hand has a lot to do with the economy which we fashion. We may end up with a situation where we have internal problems of, you know, who shares the wealth and all of that. But certainly as a nation, we could become more independent, move closer to the ideal of independence from an economic perspective, depending on how we fashion our economy. And we have an economic base now that should provide some opportunity for that fashioning of the economy.
Mr.
Now, I would
Ramos,
also make the point,
you finish, go
I
ahead.
make the point that if there is more wealth and everybody reaches a certain level, then politics starts to become less important. And so it creates an environment in which also we can start to address the political problems.
Well, that's been a socialist, communist, Marxist argument for centuries, decades. And we haven't gotten that wealth. We haven't reached that wealth. I don't know if we'll reach it with the oil economy. We may or
Which
may
one you
not.
said is a socialist Marxist argument?
That once people's economy improves, then they focus less on politics and more on their pocketbook.
I'm not sure that that's a Marxist argument. I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's a Marxist argument.
Okay.
I know it's a logical
Ralph?
argument.
I think it's very important for us to set the stage. I don't know how it's going to be done. It needs to be discussed. Set the stage where every group of people in Guyana feel that they have equal access to the resources of the country. Now, you can't have 50%, you can't expect to have 50% of one ethnic group and 50% of the one ethnic group and its allies, and 50% of the other ethnic group and its allies in every single aspect of life in Guyana. Because Guyana has developed in a specific way where groups of people concentrated or were encouraged to or went into different areas of activity. But we need to work very much on a develop the understanding of the people with policies that everybody has an equal opportunity to access what is available. That's very important. In the absence of shared governance, inclusive governance, and all of that, we need that as an important factor to develop in our life. And I think once the resources grow in Guyana, I was very pleased to hear the Vice President say that, look, you can't have money in the bank and there are children who can't afford to go to school. And I was also very pleased to say that he reminded people something that I have spoke about. I got it from a friend, but I've spoke about it, that Norway did not begin to save money until 20 years after they developed, they started producing oil. Because Norway spent the resources on building their infrastructure. And when they built the infrastructure and built two of everything, then they began to save. Guyana needs, and so that Guyana needs to spend what it earns in building its infrastructure. We're a very dilapidated country, extremely dilapidated. It will take $1 billion just to fix the roads in Georgetown. So we need to spend our money and develop the country before we can think about saving. And once that kind of money is being spent, then no matter how you try, you cannot avoid all the people of Guyana benefiting in substantial ways from that expenditure. And I think I agree with Vincent that once people begin to think about, once people begin to earn a lot of money and begin to think about other aspects of life, the sharpness and the sharp edges in our society will begin to smooth around. I believe so.
As you know, the money has not been spent. I think it's 200 something, 250 million that's in some
Oh,
US.
there's nothing yet. The money will begin to flow seriously in 5 or 6 years' time.
Okay. But in the meanwhile, I mean, the government has been spending a lot of money on education. It may not actually spend cash money because it's getting a lot of scholarships from other countries. 20,000 scholarships being offered. In fact, there are more scholarships than recipients of scholarships right now.
Let me ask a question, Vishnu. You're suggesting that those 20 are scholarships granted by other countries rather than 20,000 scholarships paid for by the government of Guyana. How authentic?
Some of them are being paid for by the government of Guyana. Some of them are being given free.
I would think the majority are being paid for.
I'm not sure.
I didn't get the impression the scholarship meant the old system where the Russians and the Chinese and the Romanians gave us scholarships. I understood scholarships to mean that they are getting scholarships because the government are granting them scholarships, but the government is paying for the tuition wherever they go.
It may very well be. You know, I stand to be corrected. It may very well be. You're probably in a better position than I am. But I don't think the Indian government is, for example, which is giving scholarships, is actually charging.
The Indian government has previously given scholarships, and I think they will continue to give them. But they might be talking about going to the Indira Gandhi Open Campus. I don't think that those are scholarships.
Okay.
We could check this out.
Yeah,
I don't think they're scholarships.
But the bottom line is that the government is giving scholarships for people to study. And people are availing themselves to it. I don't know if they've taken up all 20,000 scholarships, but that's
it's 4,000 per year, so it's not 20,000 in the first year.
Look, the reason why you don't have people to take those scholarships is because our education system, the government has done a lot, past and previous, have done a lot for education in this country, but they haven't spent. I mean, Guyana spends $300 per child per year, where Barbados spends $800 or $900 US per child per year. So we haven't touched the problem of education. So we have kindergartens, pre-K they call it in the US. Kindergarten. Then you have kindergarten education. Then you have primary school. All of these areas are we don't have any pre-K in this country. Well, very few. Then you have kindergarten. And not every child accesses kindergarten. So we have a very far way to go. That is why those scholarships, they are finding difficulty in getting people to take them up. Now, we got a lot to do in education until our monies come up to the kind of money that is spent in Trinidad, Barbados, and all of these places. We're not talking seriously about our education system.
One of my concerns, I don't have a problem with scholarships in principle, but these things have to be thoroughly worked out. And so one of my concerns is we're going to be given 4,000 scholarships and we're not bonding people. We're not bonding these guys. I still don't know what guarantee we have that we are going to get the returns on our dollar if we don't bond these people. So I have that concern. That we're told they're going to do some community service. I don't know what that really means during the course of the scholarship, but that they are free. They're not bonded at the end of it. So, you know, what are you expecting out of the investment? You're expecting the Guyanese who no longer wants to go overseas and therefore will say Ghana is the best place after sliced bread and therefore we're going to stay in Guyana. So I'm concerned about that. These scholarships, when you look at them, I don't understand the logic of scholarship that speaks to a 6 weeks course in training to repair motorcycles. I don't quite understand that. That money could well be spent in developing your technical education, developing your board of industrial training, and that what is a scholarship about somebody signing up for some course in India to learn to repair motorcycles? So that That also is a concern to me. The other area of concern is the education system. Education systems, educators are professionals. And therefore, to be in the teaching profession, it requires certain qualifications, certain certifications. I've seen scholarships which says that you are free to go and do a course in education, and you need not be a teacher or a certified teacher. You're teaching in the school system. You haven't met the requirements to be a certified teacher, but you're teaching in the school system. You get a scholarship to go and do something in some specialist area. And I am not seeing the integration back into the teaching profession in Guyana. So for me, there are things that need to be carefully thought out. Probably they are in the back room, but certainly as a citizen, reading the information that's available on these scholarships does not say to me that in every circumstance we have indeed given comprehensive thought to the development of this program, and that's my concern. And it probably has a bit to do with the issue of inclusion.
Okay, so we just got a couple minutes left, and so if I could bring it back full circle, evaluation of independence, election will be in 4 years. Do you think we're going to have electoral and constitutional reform by then, Vincent?
I would wish in a matter like this to hope rather than to think. We need it. And as citizens, we need to do and say everything to push the politicians in that direction.
Mr. Ramkaran?
I definitely don't think we'll have constitutional reform. And I think that any elections reform will be to deal with just immediate problems and nothing of a serious structural nature.
I think I'll disagree with you. I believe we are going to have electoral reforms by then. I'm not sure about constitutional reform, but I'm positive and I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic that we will have both.
We have to if I were not optimistic, I wouldn't be living in this country. You have to have a great deal of optimism to live here.
I hope in your optimism that you embrace Ralph's understanding of what electoral reform is.
Oh yes, I do subscribe to quite a bit of what he said. Yes, I mean, right? other than that, it simply
because you can have something called electoral reform, which really is not fundamentally electoral reform.
Mm-hmm. But there can only be electoral reform if I understand correctly. Both sides have to agree.
Some of the things that are being talked about, and Ralph could correct me here, don't require a 2/3 majority.
Okay. So
some of the things that have been talked about are not even does not require legislation.
And the Election Commission itself can't undertake them, cannot.
No. The commission gets the custodian of the law. They are not the crafters. They could make recommendations. We don't have a commission that is sufficiently synergized to make recommendations.
We have pretty much run out of time. Any final word, Mr. Ramkaran, before we go?
Well, thank you for having us. Thank you. I'd like to thank your viewers for tuning in, and I hope that they have benefited from what we have said.
Mr. Alexander?
Let the discussion continue so that the populace can have a disposition that will take us in the right direction.
Senior Counsel Ralph Ramkaran, GCOM Commissioner Mr. Vincent Alexander, and we must not forget he was also former Registrar of the University of Guyana. I am Vishnu Bistram. I want to thank Mr. Nohar Singh, owner-producer of Globespun 24/7, and Mr. Devin Bissoon. Thank you all for watching us tonight, and tune in again on Monday when there will be another edition of Globespun 24/7. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you very much.